Well, you might have heard about the guy who was desperate for a job, and he went to the zoo where there were some employment opportunities, and he met with the head guy there, and he found out that the only job they had an opening for is for somebody who would be willing to get into a gorilla suit and pretend to be a gorilla. He had to get into the cage, act like a gorilla for 8 hours a day because they didn't have a gorilla to put out on display at the zoo. It didn't feel right to him, but as I said, he desperately needed a job, so he said, yes, okay, I'll do it. Gets into the cage, and for several days pretends to be a gorilla, and everybody loves it. I mean, he's fooling everybody until one day he got into it just a little bit too much, and he's swinging from the trapeze, and he's going higher and higher, and he swung so high that he went over the edge of his habitat into the next habitat, which was for the lion. And he panicked. And he started to scream, "Let me out of here! Let me out of here!" I mean, he's no longer acting like a gorilla. He's totally out of character. And the lion begins walking towards him and says, "Shut up before you get us both fired." So it turns out he wasn't the only phony in the cage. Friends, we live in a world that is longing for authenticity, but doesn't quite know how to achieve it. We desire it in relationships, but we can't seem to muster it ourselves. We're unsure of ourselves, and that causes us to perpetuate behaviors that can never bring us intimacy with each other or with God. We're in a sermon series where we're determining some things that we need to stop doing in this life, so that we can have greater peace and joy in our day-to-day living. We've been framing up those items in terms of a good quit, making a good quit. A bad quit diminishes our character. A good quit enhances our character. And today's topic, I think, is a real peace bringer if we'll embrace it. And that is, I quit pretending. Proverbs 11:3. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. I got to be honest, I've had plenty of moments in my life where I have felt the stress of the guy in the gorilla suit, that I'm just afraid I'm going to be found out, that I'm pretending that I don't know what I'm pretending to know. John Ortberg says all of us carry around the knowledge that we've pretended to know things we don't really know, or achieve things that we haven't really achieved. We all pretend sometimes that we spoke out bravely when in truth we were timidly silent. We pretend we were hard at work and in fact we were wasting time. We pretend to be smarter, happier, kinder, stronger, humbler, cleaner, and better than we really are. Would you agree with that? Now, today we're going to do a little quiz, and I'm going to let you just play in your head today, okay? You don't have to raise a hand on this as I kind of walk you through this, but I've got three scenarios where I have personally pretended with other people, and I want you to sort of internally monitor whether or not you've done the same thing. If you want to give me some encouragement so I don't feel so lonely, I would say you could like give me a nod or do something you do at an auction, and it's like I'll know that we have those things in common, okay? But scenario number one, you are surfing social media at work or at home or at Starbucks, wherever, and somebody comes up to you to talk to you, to strike up conversation, and you quickly open up another window on your computer, something that makes you look more studious or productive. Anybody? I mean, again, I'm just looking for a little nod or a little, okay? All right, scenario number two. You're in a conversation with somebody, and they mention a book or a podcast or a musical group, and you get the idea from the strength of this conversation that this is something you should be aware of culturally. You ought to have some kind of knowledge of this book or this podcast or this musical group. And so you let them have the impression that you know all about that, okay? Oh, yeah, the War on Drugs, that's one of my favorite groups. Anybody ever done that? Okay, maybe, all right. I saw one auction move. How about this one? You're walking down the grocery store aisle, and you see somebody you know, somebody from PTA, somebody from work, maybe somebody even from church, somebody you knew from high school, and you think, I like that person, but they're a talker. And I'm here for like two things, and one of them's toilet paper, and I'm carrying it, and it feels kind of awkward, okay? And I don't feel like I'm looking my best, and you think, I'm just going to slip out the other side of the aisle, and I'm going to pretend like I didn't see them, right? Again, all right, there are several people that are bidding on this item. And then you go down around the next aisle, and they catch you. Hey! You're like, oh, I didn't see you there. Wow, funny running into you here. All right, friends. Today, it's time for us to become quitters in the best sense of that word, in the best way. We quit pretending. Now, we pretend about all kinds of things. We pretend in many different ways. Most of the time when we pretend, what we really do is we diminish something of ourselves because we're avoiding an opportunity to grow and to become different people. And we're limiting what God can do in the confines of whatever relationship it is that we happen to be pretending in that moment. Now, this is a really important thing for us to get a handle on because, friends, we're made in God's image, and God is a God who is perfectly himself. In other words, God doesn't pretend to be anything that he isn't. He is perfectly congruous in character, which is different from us. Because since the moment that Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the Garden of Eden, we've been uncomfortable in our own skin. We are self-conscious, and we are awkward, and we are afraid of transparency. But unlike us, God is totally at one with himself. You might remember this from the Old Testament teaching, or maybe from a movie about Moses. But, there's this character in the Old Testament, Moses, who stood before God in the form of a burning bush. And God gave Moses a task to do. He said, I want you to go and I want you to get my people out of Egypt. And Moses said, if I do that, if I go and say, I'm supposed to get these people out of Egypt, they're going to ask who sent me. So who should I say sent me when they ask the question? And God says, my name is, drum roll, my name is I Am. It's so cool. He says, tell them that the great I Am has sent you. The one who is. The one who exists. The one who has always existed. I Am. The one who's at perfect harmony within himself. He sends you. God has perfect authenticity, complete transparency of who he is. But as his creation, we're not there. So we pretend. Somebody said that God took tremendous effort making every single human being unique, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to be somebody else or trying to be something different. But what if we were to quit all that pretending? What would life look like if we were to do that? Well, our relationships would change, I think, in significant ways. First, our relationship with other people would change dramatically. Relationships would be whole. There'd be less shame. There'd be less loneliness. We'd live with greater acceptance of one another because we would be totally open about flaws with one another. We wouldn't be hiding ourselves. We'd challenge each other in ways that we normally don't challenge each other. And the result of that would be a realness of our relationships. And they'd reach new depth. And I want you to see also, our relationship with God would change dramatically. There'd be no more hiding from him. We could finally believe God completely when we read the Bible. We wouldn't have to carry around hidden guilt and shame because we'd have already taken that stuff, that ugly part of ourself, to him. We'd have been open with him about him. In humility, we could stop pretending that we were better than anybody else or that we deserved God's love in some extra way somehow. Instead, we could live on the same plane as everybody else, as fellow recipients of a transformative love that's undeserved. Now, if we could experience better and fuller and deeper relationships with other people and with God, then why in the world would we keep ourselves attached to pretense? Well, I can think of a few reasons. One of which is that we want to be accepted. And our desire for acceptance trumps authenticity, and we pretend. I mean, I want you to like me. And because I want you to like me, I might let myself be molded in ways in order for that to happen. There was this pop psychology book that was out in the early 70s, and it had this really long title, but the title of the book was, Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am? Kind of a cool title, right? I think I picked up a copy for like 10 cents at a yard sale one time. But the basic logic of the book was pretty interesting. The logic of the book was, if I tell you who I really am, with no pretending, you might reject that. And I don't want to be rejected. In fact, I would rather pretend to be something that I'm not and have you reject that version of me, because I'll at least know you rejected that and not the real me. Because subconsciously, I know that that's not who I am. But if I'm truly authentic and you reject that, well, that's the only me I've got. So I'm going to protect that. And you see the point that he tries to make there is that my desire for acceptance trumps my truthfulness. Even if the payoff for being authentic could be great, the risk is too high. And so I hold back. I pretend. I think another reason we pretend is that we just want to avoid conflict. And we want to avoid anything that could seem awkward to us. Don't you hate it when somebody puts you in an awkward situation? Maybe they'd ask you a direct question that you would never ask somebody else, or you wouldn't want to be asked. Or they bait you with some kind of political bait to see if they can lead you into some sort of conflict. There are some people who love to do that and they just thrive on creating those kinds of moments. So to avoid conflict or to avoid feeling awkward in any way, we'll pretend. We'll project a phony self. We'll agree to things we would never ordinarily agree to. We'll lie. Yeah, your outfit looks great. We can find ourselves betraying convictions because we don't want to feel awkward. So we go with the flow and we pretend. You ever heard of a game called Truth or Dare? Almost everybody chooses the dare because it's easier to knock on a neighbor's door and run away than it is to actually be vulnerable and say something that other people would see a reflection in you. I mean, for a 15-year-old, what's the bigger risk? Do a Fortnite dance at your cafeteria table or actually tell the truth about something you've been hiding? If I do the dance, people will laugh and say, oh, I did a dance because he was playing a game. But if I reveal that truth and it gets rejected, boy, that lasts forever. I'd rather pretend and avoid that. I don't usually like to use illustrations where I'm a good example. First of all, because it happens so rarely. But secondly, if I did it very often, I would be pretending. I'd be giving you the impression that I'm like making great choices all the time and I'm on a different level of Christianity than I really am. But every now and then I get one right, you know? And you got to rejoice in those moments. And this was a major victory for me in this realm of pretending. I was at a class reunion several years ago, and they did the thing where our name tags were actually our senior pictures. And you wore a copy of your senior picture. Yeah. Now, some people look exactly like they looked before with just their wrinklier version of themselves, okay? And so when you're looking at them, it's a no-brainer. You know right away names and faces. Other people, not so much, okay? And there was a woman who I'd seen throughout the evening having conversations, and she came up to me and said, Joe, I can't believe it's you, man. I can't believe you look great. Now, that should have clued me into the fact that she was a liar. But I looked at her name tag, and she did not look familiar to me at all. And she could see my puzzled look, and so she says very incredulously, don't you remember me? I'm Beth. It's me. I was like, yeah, Beth, I'm sorry. I'm just a little bit fuzzy. She's like, Beth, we had algebra together. You know, I used to hang around Tim. I can't believe you don't remember. I got sick at the prom, which really didn't whittle it down. And she spilled out several more things that were supposed to jog my memory of who she was. And I was like, I feel really bad about this, but I just don't remember. After about 10 minutes of this conversation, she said, I can't believe this. I've been pulling this gag all night. You're the first one to admit it. I didn't go to school with you guys. She's like, I'm with that guy Ron over there. I just brought up the picture. I was so glad, man, because they had identified me as a pastor. They'd asked me to pray at this reunion. I thought, oh, I dodged a bullet on that one. But we can be such great pretenders, can't we? And we really can. But God has not asked us to avoid every awkward conversation. God has not asked us to avoid every conflict, because sometimes conflict can spur our growth. I had a friend recently point out a difference to me, a nuance. And she said, you know, there's a difference between kindness and niceness. And the Bible commands us to be kind. It doesn't talk about niceness in the way that our culture embraces it. In other words, we often interpret every point where there could be conflict as a place where we can't be nice. And so instead of having the conflict, we nice our way out of it. But that's not necessarily what God calls us to do. He calls us to be kind in conflict. And I can be kind and I can be firm at the same time, and I don't have to deny who I am. Well, one other area, and this is true of both of our relationship with people and with God, and that is we pretend when we're covering up our shame. In our starter group the other night, we watched this video, and this pastor was teaching. He's a pastor in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was telling the story about his children. When his children were young, they had bought this expensive couch, and they told their children that they weren't allowed to eat or drink anywhere near the couch. But one day, one of his daughters spilled a red gooey drink on the couch, and she looked around, and nobody was there. And she just flipped the cushion, okay? And she went back to pretending that everything was all right. And at first she was scared, but time passed. And then she pretended and pretended and pretended like it never happened. But one day they were cleaning the couch. And they flipped the cushion over. And the stain was there. And it was that moment. And he said, she caved like a cheap lawn chair. She had been found out as a faker. Why did she pretend? Shame. Shame. And this is one area where it's really true when it comes between us and God, right? We're a lot like Adam and Eve, hiding in the Garden of Eden as if God didn't know where to look. Pretending with God rarely works, but we still, well, it never works, but we still do it. Now, friends, when we choose to pretend rather than choosing the path towards authenticity, we just create more problems, and those problems compound. And I want us to take just a couple of minutes here to review this story from a character in the Bible, and he was on a really good trajectory, but he began to make some poor choices. And he did that because he wanted to project this image, an image of something that he wasn't. And as he was doing that, his life began to unravel. Now, the character in the Old Testament is a guy by the name of David. And for a long time, he's just this great example of the real deal. He is called in the Bible a man after God's own heart. But he's often defined by his very biggest mistake. I want to do a quick review of this story, and I want you to see how his pretending was the cause of a big fall in his life. 2 Samuel chapter 11 highlights the sin of David. It says, in the spring, at the time when the kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army, but David remained in Jerusalem. So instead of leading his troops into battle, he stays back. Verse 2 says, one evening David got up from his bed and he walked around the roof of the palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to go get her. She came to him, and he slept with her, and then she went back home. Now David was supposed to be the spiritual leader of his nation, but he had shirked a lot of responsibility, and he was just kind of going through the motions. He was pretending. He didn't go off to head off the troops like he should have done as the leader of the army. Instead, he'd stayed behind. And then he indulged in an affair. He'd broken 2 of the 10 commandments just in these few verses. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. Don't commit adultery. And at this point, after these first 4 verses of this chapter, you think, well, David's had his fun, and he probably just wants to go on pretending before the people that he's this great paragon of virtue. But there's a twist in verse 5. Everything turns upside down. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I'm pregnant. Now, how in the world was David going to hide that? And Bathsheba's husband was off to war, and he was sure to be found out to be a fraud. So he concocted a plan to keep his reputation sterling. He sent for Bathsheba's husband Uriah under false pretenses. Uriah came back to see David, and David inquired about the battle, and then he made some small talk, and then he gives him leave from the battle so that Uriah would go home and sleep with his wife, and he'll think that the baby is his. So there goes another one of the 10 commandments, by the way. He lies. But Uriah is too honorable to do what David expects. He sleeps at the gate of the palace. Notice verse 10. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. David had pretended for so long, he forgot what the real deal looked like. Uriah was too honorable to go home and be with his wife. But David had to cover up this sin because he had to project this image. So he tried to get Uriah drunk and trick him to going home. Verse 12. David said to him, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. David tried to trick him. He tried to get him so drunk that he'd sort of just wander his way home. But he doesn't do it. So David breaks the 4th of the commandments that he's going to break in just a few days. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. And in it he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he'll be struck down and die. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. David, with premeditation, had Uriah killed. And then he felt relieved. His sin was covered up. He'd effectively pretended. His reputation was intact. 2 Samuel chapter 11 finishes by saying, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. And the last phrase of the chapter reads, but the thing David did displeased the Lord. And what we don't know immediately in reading through this is that between chapter 11 and chapter 12, a year goes by. A year passes, a whole year. And David just kept pretending. He pretended before the people. He pretended before God week after week. He kept going to worship, kept putting on his worship face. Day after day, he said his prayers, but he ignored the elephant standing between him and God. And so God confronted David's pretending by sending him a pretend scenario. Chapter 12 says, the Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. And he raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food and drank from his cup and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who'd come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to this poor man and prepared it for the one who'd come to him. And notice the response that David has as he's listening to this story unfold. Verse 5 says, David burned with anger against this man. Isn't it interesting that David could see the sin in somebody else's life? He couldn't spot it in his own life. Verse 5 says, David burned with anger against the man, and he said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this, he deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Now, David knew the law. And in Exodus chapter 22, the law was clear. If someone stole or killed a sheep, he'd pay back 4 sheep for the one that he'd taken. He knew the law. That was justice. David said he deserves to die, but he's at least going to do justice that the Bible talks about. But David finds out this little parable is not about a lamb, it's about a king. And verse 7 says, then Nathan said to David, you are the man. You're the man who did this. Now that story continues to unfold in the Bible there in 2 Samuel chapter 12. But what happens is that David eventually repents. He's sorry for his sin. And David quits pretending. And God forgives him. God, the gracious God, forgives him. But the people around David, boy, he'd done a lot of damage there. And so it was years of untangling that mess. But one of the cool things about the Bible is that we can read sometimes in other places in the Bible about the same events. And David writes about what he was feeling during this time in Psalm 32. And so notice Psalm 32, verse 3. I think this is really good because maybe some of you are in this place right now. David said, when I kept silent, so when I was just pretending and acting like everything was okay, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me, and my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. You know, when you're hiding your sin, it takes a toll. And when you're projecting an image, and that image is getting further and further away from what you really are, that's stress. And David said, I felt heavy stress on me, God. Verse 5. But then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I'll confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let everyone who is godly pray to you while you may be found. Friends, David knew something important here. He knew that there are some guilty people who don't get forgiven, and there are some people who are guilty who do get forgiven by the gracious work of God's redemption. What's the difference? So Exodus 34 reads, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. What makes the difference between those who receive forgiveness and those who don't? It's the humility to admit that you're a sinner. And it's the ability to stop pretending when it comes to you and God. And risk it all. And tell God that you really do know who you really are. And you agree with other people too that we're all on that level together. Can I tell you something? If it were not for the grace of God, I couldn't stand up here and teach anything in the Bible. I am not super holy. I'm an example of how great God's love is when it reaches to deeply flawed people. That's me. And the people around you, you know, sometimes you walk into church and you look around at everybody and think, man, everybody else has it all together. You know what? That's not true here. None of us have figured it out perfectly. We've just come to the place where we've decided to stop pretending like we have. So, my friends, it's time for another good quit. Quit pretending with other people. It causes distance. It creates separation. When I pretend, I can never fully be accepted by somebody else because they don't really know me. And quit pretending with God because He already knows my sin. And the beauty of it is He loves me already. And I'm not hiding anything from Him, really. And there is such great freedom for the unpretentious person. But I will say this. This quit takes incredible courage. Really does. And my hope for you and my prayer for you and for me is that we would experience this week, that we would be real with one another, because you only compound your problems when you pretend you don't have any. Let's pray about this. God, would you give us courage? Would you give us what we need so that we can be real, approachable, that we wouldn't project some image of ourselves that really isn't true, that we just be who we are, humbly. When it comes to other people, to not feel like we need to sacrifice our character in order to gain their acceptance. That we just live in the sweet spot of being who you made us to be. And when it comes to you, God, we don't want to pretend. Thank you for loving us, as messed up, as flawed as we are. Help us to have those humble spirits when it comes between us and you, so we can admit freely who we are and experience the kind of love you have for us. That's our prayer today in the name of Jesus. Amen.